There are certain video game soundtracks that immediately transport you back to a specific time in your life. You hear a few notes and suddenly you're a kid again, sitting in front of your Game Boy exploring a world that somehow felt much bigger than the tiny green screen in front of you. Pokemon's original soundtrack is absolutely one of those, but I don't think the music of Pokémon Red, Blue, and for some countries Yellow has lasted simply because so many of us grew up with it. Nostalgia certainly does play a part, but there's something more to these songs than the memories attached to them. There is something about the way they were written, arranged, and used throughout the games that gives them an identity that still feels remarkably strong decades later. Even when you take away the memories of playing Pokemon as a kid, these melodies still have a strange ability to stick with you. More than 20 years later, these tracks can still sound charming, mysterious, exciting, or even surprisingly emotional without needing the nostalgia attached to them. The limitations of the Game Boy hardware didn't stop Pokemon from creating memorable melodies. If anything, they forced the soundtrack to become incredibly deliberate about every note and every sound it could produce, from the adventurous routes and cheerful towns to the eerie atmosphere of Lavender Town and the intensity of its unforgettable battle themes. Gen 1's music understood how much personality could be created with remarkably little. It doesn't have the production quality of modern video games or Pokemon games, nor does it really need it, because ultimately a great melody doesn't need to be technically impressive or surrounded by layers of sound to leave an impression. It just needs to be memorable. If you look at Pokémon Red, Blue and Yellow today, there is no denying that the games have ultimately aged. The tiny sprites, limited color palette, simple environments and extremely basic animations are charming in their own way, but they are also clearly products of the Game Boy. What looked impressive or completely normal in the late 90s can now feel almost primitive compared to what we're used to today. And that's not necessarily a criticism, because those limitations are a huge part of why Gen 1 still has so much character. There is something genuinely charming about looking at those little sprites and seeing how much personality the developers managed to squeeze out of such a limited system, especially when you consider how little they have actually had to work with. But visually, you can immediately tell that you're looking at a game from a long gone era. The graphics have aged because technology has moved forward, and there's no real way around that. A modern player can appreciate what Gen 1 accomplished while still recognizing that its presentation is unmistakably rooted in the mid to late 90s. The music, however, is a completely different story. You can hear a Gen 1 track today, and despite knowing exactly what hardware it was created for, it doesn't carry the same feeling of being outdated. The sound quality itself is obviously limited, but the limits itself aren't there because the melodies aren't limited, and that's an incredibly important distinction to make. They aren't dependent on high-quality instruments, realistic sound effects, or complicated arrangements to work. The music is built around ideas that are much harder for technology to make obsolete. Strong melodies, memorable rhythms, and distinctive themes that immediately gives each location or moment its own identity. You could completely understand why the graphics look old, while simultaneously forgetting that the music you're listening to was composed for a handheld console from 1996. There is no graphical equivalent to a good melody suddenly becoming irrelevant because better technology exists. If the melody works, it works, and Gen 1 has an almost ridiculous number of melodies that still do. That's what makes the contrast between the visuals and the soundtrack so incredible. When you look at an old Gen 1 screenshot, you can immediately see its age. You can see the resolution, the limited colors, the simple character designs, and all the little technical compromises that had to be made for the hardware. You can appreciate them for what they are, but you can't really separate them from the era they came from. When you listen to its music, however, you're more likely to recognize it than you think about how old it is. The Game Boy's limitations are still audible, but they don't prevent the music from communicating exactly what it needs to. Route themes still sound adventurous, towns still have their personalities, caves can still feel mysterious and unsettling, and the battle themes still have that sense of urgency that they had decades ago. The technology behind the music has aged, but the musical ideas themselves haven't, because those ideas were never dependent on the technology of the era in the first place. And I think that's ultimately one of the biggest differences between something being old and something being timeless. Pokémon Gen 1's graphics are fascinating, precisely because they show us how far games have come since the mid to late 90s. While its soundtrack shows us that good music doesn't necessarily move forward in the same way technology does, a better screen can make a game look sharper. More detailed and more expressive and more powerful hardware can make music sound richer, fuller and technically more impressive, but neither automatically makes a melody more memorable. In fact, sometimes all that extra technology can make it easier to forget how simple and important the underlying composition actually is. Gen 1 may look like a relic of its time, but put its soundtrack on today in the background, and those melodies still know exactly how to make you feel. That's something technology can enhance, but it can never, ever manufacture. One of the most impressive things about Pokémon Gen 1's soundtrack is how easily certain themes can trigger what I can only describe as a ratatouille moment. You can hear a melody that you haven't thought about in years, and suddenly you're not just remembering the game, you can almost remember being there. A particular route theme can bring you back the feeling of wandering through Kanto for the first time, while a town theme can immediately remind you of where you were in the adventure, what you were doing, and even how you felt at that point in your childhood. It's almost like the music has preserved little pieces of those memories that you didn't even realize were still there. And that isn't something exclusive to Pokemon, but Gen 1's soundtrack is particularly good at it because its melodies are so distinctive and so closely tied to specific places and moments that you don't need to hear an entire song before your brain can recognize it. Sometimes a few seconds is enough to completely pull you back, and suddenly you're not listening to an old Game Boy soundtrack anymore, you're remembering a long-lost childhood experience. But then there are themes that don't just bring back memories, they bring back feelings. Few pieces of Pokemon music demonstrate that better than the music that plays when your Pokemon is close to fainting. Even after all these years, that theme can create a very specific kind of anxiety that is almost impossible to replicate with anything else. It's repetitive, urgent, and deliberately uncomfortable because the game is essentially telling you that something is going wrong and you need to do something about it. You know that you're probably only a few steps away from losing your Pokemon, and suddenly the entire battle feels different. What makes it so effective is that the music doesn't need to become louder or more complicated to create that tension. It simply repeats that warning until you can't ignore it, and after hearing it enough times as a kid, those few notes become almost instinctively associated with panic. Even now, hearing that theme can make you feel like you need to reach for a potion, switch your Pokemon, or finish the battle as quickly as possible, despite knowing that you're sitting safely in front of a screen decades removed from your first ever playthrough. And then there's Lavender Town, which might be the most obvious example of Gen 1's music having an identity that has survived long beyond the game and the technology and hardware itself. The infamous stories surrounding Lavender Town have become part of Pokemon's wider internet mythology. But even if you completely ignore the rumors, the memes, the creepypastas, and exaggerated stories that have surrounded it over the years, the actual music is still genuinely unsettling. It's strange, dissonant, and just uncomfortable enough to make you feel like something isn't quite right. There's a loneliness to it as well, which makes perfect sense given what Lavender Town represents within the game and Kanto as a region. But the soundtrack doesn't simply tell you that you're somewhere sad, it makes the entire town feel wrong. And somehow, despite how creepy it can be, you can't help but enjoy listening to it. That's what makes it so memorable. It isn't scary because the internet told us it was scary. It's memorable because the music itself creates an atmosphere that is difficult to shake, and the fact that so many people, myself included, still immediately recognize it speaks to how just effective that atmosphere really truly was. That's ultimately what separates these themes from simple background music. Pokémon Generation 1's soundtrack doesn't just accompany what you're doing, it can actively change how you're experiencing or feeling in the moment. One song can make you nostalgic enough to feel like you're playing Pokémon for the first time again. Another can make you genuinely anxious over something as simple as a health bar, and another can make an otherwise ordinary location feel deeply unsettling. Those are very different emotions, but the music manages to communicate all of them with remarkably simple tools and almost none of the elaborate production we'd expect from a modern video game soundtrack. Decades later, these songs still have the ability to make us remember, worry, smile, and even feel uncomfortable. And if the music can still make you feel something that strongly after all this time, I think that's about as timeless as it gets. It's not simply music that we remember because we played and we love Pokemon, it's music that helped make those experiences memorable in the first place. And maybe that's why Pokémon Gen 1's music has lasted as well as it has. The games themselves can be looked at as snapshots of our time, with graphics, technology and design limitations that immediately remind us that we're playing something from the late to mid 90s. But the music somehow exists outside of that. It can still make you nostalgic, it can still make you anxious, it can still make you uncomfortable, and it can still make you excited in a way that doesn't require us to have grown up with it. The soundtrack doesn't need to pretend that it's modern, because what makes it memorable has nothing to do with being modern in the first place. There will always be newer Pokemon games with bigger soundtracks, more advanced technology, and music that can do things the Game Boy simply couldn't dream of doing, but I don't think that is what makes Pokemon Gen 1's music any less special. If anything, hearing those simple melodies decades later only makes it more impressive that they were able to create such emotion with so little. Pokemon Red, Blue and Yellow may look like games from a lifetime ago, but their music still feels alive. And as long as a few familiar notes can bring back an entire plethora of memories, make your heart sink when your Pokemon is near the fainting, or make Lavender Town feel just a little bit wrong, Pokemon Generation 1 will always sound timeless. Oh,